Today's video, as you can see, is about suicide statistics. And while this may seem like kind of a dry topic, dry subject, we can see there's plenty of implication behind many of the statistics that we'll be looking about in the next few minutes. So the first thing I want to point out, as you can see on this first slide, is that we'll be talking about rates of suicide and rates of other public health problems. And typically these are phrased in terms of per 100,000 per year. So we'll see in a few minutes that the rate of suicide in the United States in 2019 was 14.5. And so what that means is 14.5 per 100,000 people per year. So in that year. Okay, so all of these rates are per 100,000. Before we get to that, though, I thought you might find this interesting. This is a graph of the overall U.S. suicide rate starting back in 1900 up till 2018, I believe it is. The top line, the blue line, is males. The bottom line, which is green, is females. And the middle line is both. So it makes sense. The middle line is the average of the higher male rate and the lower female rate. And you might notice from this that the suicide rate in the United States was the highest in the early 1930s during the Great Depression, which highlights, I think, one of the macro factors that we'll be talking about a little bit later on. The role of the economy, unemployment, and in general people's financial situation, or I guess we should say their perception of their financial situation. Now, just before that, we see that there was a decline in suicide in 1917, 1918, 1919, 1920, and usually that's attributed to the effect of World War I, and that is either or both increased employment in the war effort, and the general finding is that increased employment leads to decreased suicide, so that could be it. And it also maybe represents social integration, which is for any group of people, to the extent that people feel connected and belonging and part of a group, then that's increased social integration, and that leads to a lower rate of suicide. When people feel disconnected, alienated, not really part of the group, that's a lack of social integration or social disintegration, and that leads to higher rates of suicide. So this maybe represent the World War I effect, may well represent both increased employment and increased social integration. You can see also during the first half of the 1940s, especially looks like it goes through about 1943, 1944, once again, decreased suicide rate. Same thing for World War II. We don't see this effect later on for the Vietnam War. What you also might notice is the increase in suicide across the board starting in about 2000, and it's continued to go up, and so that, although actually, what I'll get to in a minute is we had a slight decrease in 2019 as compared to 2018. But in general, there's been an increase in suicide since about the year 2000 for men and women, especially men. Okay. Now, here's some overall numbers, and let me point out that I've included in Sakai a sheet. In fact, I'll show it to you. A sheet published by the American Association of Suicidology, which is where I obtained these statistics. And I posted this on Sakai, and so there's a lot more detail, and you might be able, or you would be able, I think, to follow along even more closely on this original sheet. I've sort of copied over some of the main statistics onto these PowerPoint slides, but originally it comes from this handout from AAS. But you can see, just in terms of the macro numbers, for the nation as a whole, the country as a whole, in 2019, 47,511 people died of suicide. It's a few hundred less than it was the previous year. And in 2018, well, first of all, the 2019 rate, as you can see, is 14.5 per 100,000 per year. The previous year, 2018, it was 14.7. So we see a slight decrease in the rate of overall suicide, which mostly took place among white men and white people in general. A slight decrease in white females and a bigger decrease, but only a few hundred still in white male numbers. You can also immediately see that suicide is primarily about white people. 42,000 out of the 47,000 were white. And you can also immediately see that it's much more male than female by 3 or 4 to 1 ratio. Something like 77%, I think, of the completed suicides in the U.S. are among males. So we got 37,000 versus 10,000. Oh, let me mention, by the way, that except for one slide later on, all of these numbers I'm going to be showing to you right now are completed suicide, formally adjudicated by the medical examiner or the coroner as a suicide. We're not talking about suicide attempts or suicide ideation or anything like that, except we will a little bit later. All these numbers are official deaths. Now you can also see that the rate for whites, 16.4 per 100,000, as compared to the rate for non-whites, only 7.6 per 100,000. So dramatically higher rate among white people. And then among non-whites, which includes all different minorities, then African Americans are still even lower at 7.1 per 100,000. Which has traditionally been true, that suicide has been a white phenomenon in the United States and many other countries as well. And then a few more numbers about age range. We can see that older adults, 65 and over, have a much higher rate of 17 per 100,000, higher than the overall rate of 14.5. Young people have a rate slightly lower, 13.9 per 100,000, slightly lower than the overall rate of 14.5. So although we hear a lot of discussion about teen suicide and things like that, really young people have a lower than average rate. And although I didn't put it on a slide here, if you look on the sheet that I mentioned a minute ago from the American Association of Suicidology, about a fourth or a third of the way down toward the right is a small little chart that lists leading causes of death among 15 to 24-year-olds. Accidents are much higher than suicide. But what it also shows in a little small box there is that if we're looking at the young people, still it's the 20 to 24-year-old half of that 15 to 24-year-old that carry the bulk of it. So among 10 to 14-year-olds in the United States, a total of 534 suicides, a rate of 2.6 per 100,000 per year. Among the teenage part, 15 to 19-year-olds, a rate of 10.5, and the 20 to 24-year-olds, a rate of 17.3. So even when we look, like on the chart on the PowerPoint here, that the rate is 13.9, really it's much higher among the early 20s group than among the late teen group. So you can take a look at that on the American Association of Suicidology sheet. But it's just striking how much attention the media and people give to young adult and teen suicide, when even you can see that the rate is lower than the nation as a whole. But I think that just represents most adults have difficult time coping with suicide in general, and to think of a young person who might be suicidal is even more incomprehensible. I think that's changing. I hope that's changing. But okay, and we see that middle-aged men it is men, but it's middle-aged people from 45 to 64 have one of the highest rates at 19.5 per 100,000, exceeded only by the 85-year-olds, whose rate in 2019 was 20.1, as you can see at the bottom of the slide. Now I put that on there even though I don't have the numbers or the numbers per day, because they weren't listed on the American Association of Suicidology sheet, only because for the last 10 years, the highest rate of suicide has been that middle-aged group from 45 to 64. And this, of course, represents what has been called deaths of despair. That it has a lot to do, obviously, with suicide, but it has to do with increasing rates of alcohol and drug use, increasing rates of accidental overdose, especially of opioids. So deaths of despair really references middle-aged, white, non-college educated men who have often fallen on troubled economic times, and that becomes reflected in the higher suicide rate. So that group from 45 to 64, the deaths of despair suicides, has been the highest rate of suicide for the last 10 years. And for the first time now in 10 years, in 2019, the old group, the 85 and above group, which again is represents mostly men, is slightly higher at 20.1. They were higher before, but as I said, for the last 10 years, the older middle-aged white people, mostly white men, have been the highest rate of suicide, and still quite high. If we look a little closer at some of the demographic breakdowns, we can see, as I mentioned before, that the black rate, the African American rate, much lower than the white rate, the Hispanic rate lower. You can see the Native American rate is up there, though, although obviously not as high as white males, and Asians and Pacific Islanders at a fairly low rate. I guess one of the statistics that jumps out at people here most often is the African American female rate of only 2.8 per 100,000 per year. And people say, well, how can this be? Because black women have a tough time. They're discriminated against and oppressed because of their race and because of their gender. They are suffering a lot of difficulties that white men don't have to face. White privilege is real, obviously, and you would think that would show up, in a lower suicide rate for white men and a higher suicide rate for black women, but that's not the case. You can see the difference is huge, right? The difference is like, 7-8 times. If we round up African American females to 3 times 9 is 27, 9 times. White males have a rate 9 times higher. So obviously you may have some thoughts about that. We'll talk about that in our in-class session this week. However, that may be changing too. There is a report that came out last summer by the Trace, which is a nonprofit group that deals with gun violence, and they found that as of July 24th of last summer, there were a total of 57 suicides among black men and women, when the yearly average over the past 10 years has only been 65 per year. So just past midsummer, 57, and the typical yearly rate 65. So you can see during 2020 that they were heading to a higher overall total, significantly high overall total. I haven't been able to find any numbers, though, about how it ended up by the end of the year. This is the only report of this that I've been able to find so far. But as you might expect, that these were people mostly from the south side and the west side, which have high rates of poverty, unemployment, and who have been hit really hard by the coronavirus pandemic, much higher rates of illness and death. Most of these deaths were male, 40% were with guns, a third were by hanging, and also part of the issue is the lack of access to mental health treatment. And of course, the same unfortunate issue of Black Lives Matter is the killing of black people, especially black men, by police, which certainly leads to PTSD, depression, and anxiety among black people in general, black males in particular. Suicide methods in 2018, did I change this? Oh yeah, this is 2018 because these are numbers that I got from a different source, but it's pretty congruent with what we have here. But I was able to find these numbers to break out the male-female difference. The AAS sheet just lumps it together. But overall in the country, 50.4% of suicides are by firearm, And when we break that out for 2018, it's 50-60. And this chart, by the way, you read down, not across. So basically we're saying that of all the male suicides, 56% were by guns. Of all the female suicides, 31.5% were by guns. Of all the male suicides, 28% were by suffocation, which means either hanging or strangulation, and 30% of the women, and you can see further down, poisoning, other methods, cutting and piercing, drowning, much lower numbers. But a separation here, especially with firearms, and this is what people have traditionally talked about. One explanation. Here we are. One explanation of why men have such a higher rate of suicide than women is that men use more lethal means, like guns. And while that may be true, it kind of, kicks the question down the road, because a related or the next question that one would ask is, well, is that intentional? Is it simply that men have more lethal means available to them, or is this intentional in the sense that more men intend to die when they make a suicide attempt, and more women, or at least some women, have a lower intent to die, and it represents a cry for help? And we can talk about that too. Many of these questions have no answers because they're macro level statistics, and the only way to really answer that would be to have a representative sample and really dig in and learn more about that sample of individual suicides. Now, we don't have that. We do have a number of studies called psychological autopsy studies that do look more closely on a case-by-case basis of groups of suicides, but they've tended to focus more on the issue of mental illness, the representation of people with depression versus schizophrenia versus substance abuse, things like that, which we will talk about later, and rarely have looked more closely at trying to understand, for example, why the choice of method in each case and how they tend to add up to this. If we look more closely at the suicide rate by age, which is also on the AAS sheet, again, we'll see the peak in middle age, downward trend, and then now in 2019, the peak at 85 and above. Now, here's a related issue I think that's really interesting, and this is on the AAS sheet on the lower right of the first page. And we can see that suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States in 2019. And again, with that 14.5 per 100,000 and that total of 47,500 deaths, as compared to, if we go back to the top, for example, heart disease with a death rate of 200 per 100,000 people per year, for a rate of almost, for a total number of almost 660,000. Cancer with a total number of about 600,000 and a rate of 182. And I guess I would like to just call your attention to the causes of death, numbers 1, 2, 4, and 5, right? Heart disease, cancer, chronic lower respiratory diseases, and strokes, which account for an enormous number of deaths here. The top, basically saying 3 of the top 4 causes of death all have a significant issue kind of hiding behind these numbers, and I wonder if you have an idea what that might be. Okay, something that's kind of behind for a lot of people who die of heart disease, cancer, respiratory diseases like COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and strokes. And of course, what I'm talking about is cigarettes and tobacco. So epidemiologists and health experts have looked more closely at these what do we got here? 6,500, 1,200,000, 15 million and a half deaths or something like that, and have been able to separate out some of the underlying causes, and have determined that in a given year, and this one in particular is 2017, that cigarette smoking causes the deaths of about 450,000 people. 450,000 people die from cigarette smoking every year, and that even includes approximately 38,000 who die from secondhand smoke who weren't necessarily even smokers themselves. And so you can see why, the tobacco companies have to keep advertising and have to keep looking for new people to take up smoking, because they're killing their own customers every year, almost 500,000 of them every year. It's quite a business model, you would say, right? Now this also compares to other drug use. For example, a total of about 72,000 drug overdose deaths per year, which was up almost 10% from the year before. This is 2017 statistics. And again, I think we're talking here a lot about deaths of despair. Again, the white, middle-aged, non-college educated, blue-collar guy, who many of whom have fallen on hard times. Of the overdose deaths altogether, 49,000 of them are opioids, 8,000 are benzodiazepines, and often benzos and overdoses are benzos and alcohol mixed together. So anyway, 8,000 deaths there. So once again, a big number here. And then finally, alcohol-related deaths, which represent both alcohol poisoning, which is really alcohol overdose. And here's another example. So why do we call it a drug overdose, but we call it alcohol poisoning? And it's the same thing. It's an overdose on one occasion of too much of the drug in question. But somehow our culture names it differently, I don't know, it seems to me to disguise what we're talking about. So it's alcohol overdoses, motor vehicle accidents, and cirrhosis of the liver lead to alcohol being a primary factor in 88,000 deaths per year. Okay, and then finally we wonder about marijuana. So we have cigarette smoking, we have drug overdoses, we have alcohol-related deaths. What about marijuana? So the total number of deaths from overdose of marijuana in 2017, zero. Now I don't want to discount that entirely, because I wonder, and I guess many people wonder, about motor vehicle accidents for people who were high on marijuana. And I know in Colorado and some of the other states, we'll see what happens here in Illinois now, that it's very difficult to separate that out, because there isn't any quick little test that the police can do or a lab can do about whether people have THC in their bloodstream or not. But that is an issue. And I also want to say, by pointing out that there are zero overdose deaths of marijuana or zero marijuana-related deaths, I'm not pushing marijuana. I don't smoke marijuana myself. I'm not advocating marijuana. In fact, I think for young people, including many of you in this class who are still under the age of 25, it's a bad idea because of the potential negative aspects on brain development. But I would say there's something screwy about our legal system. When cigarette smoking kills 450,000 people, it's legal. Alcohol kills 88,000 people, it's legal. And up until now, and still in some states, marijuana was not legal, with a much lower danger profile. Another aspect of the statistics, which is on the second page of the handout from the American Association of Suicidology, is suicide rates by region of the U.S. And I think the highlight here is the much higher suicide rate in the mountain states. You can see the list here that I put on the slide: New Mexico, Wyoming, Alaska, Idaho, Colorado, etc. And we can talk about, in our synchronous session, we can talk about why would the suicide rate necessarily be higher in these states. But I'll give you a quick highlight. Again, there's no exactly right or wrong answer. We can marshal our evidence on one side or another, because in all cases we're talking about correlation, not causation. But nonetheless, the higher rates of gun ownership are typically looked at when we look at the higher rates of suicide in these areas. And then let's talk briefly about suicide attempts. So this is the one statistic that's not focused on deaths by suicide, but rather suicide attempts. And this study comes from a survey done by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the federal government, from 2017. And they found, projecting it to a national, from a sample, projecting to a national population, that probably about 10,700,000 people that year had suicide ideation, meaning they had thoughts about suicide. And I believe the way they worded the question in the survey includes a word like seriously, like have, in the past year, have you seriously considered killing yourself? As you may know, if you exactly how you word the question might yield very different answers. And in this case, almost all of the surveys in recent years, well, 25 years, I think, have really focused on using words like seriously focused on suicide, seriously considered suicide, not just say, have you thought about suicide? So seriously considered, 10,700,000. Of those, or in addition, about 3,300,000 people said they made a plan. And I want to just quickly point out right here that many people, and I think, in fact, many social workers that you may interact with when you get out in the field, or maybe those that you have interacted with now, are confused about what plan means. And some people think, well, if the person says, I might use my gun, or I might, jump off a tall place, that's a plan. That's not. That's a method. The method is the gun, the jumping, the overdose, the hanging. A plan is a method plus the details about how that person is going to go about it. So it's not just a gun, but it's they're going to shoot themselves a week from Tuesday when the rest of the family is not at home. So it's the plan plus all the details about the specific time, place, and circumstances that a person's going to carry it out. And a method is simply the gun, the jumping, the overdose. And again, though, I think a lot of people use this incorrectly, which confuses things. And in the survey, I'm not sure if they defined a plan. They may have left it open-ended for each respondent to define it themselves. Anyway, 3,300,000 people said they made a plan. Of those, 1,200,000 actually made an attempt, about 1/3, and the other 2 million, or 2/3, did not make an attempt. But in addition, about 200,000 people made an attempt with no plan, which is 1/7 of the people who made an attempt with a plan. And we'll talk about that later. This gets us into the area of impulsive suicide, where people who I'm sure have thought about suicide previously in their lives, but did not make a plan about where, when, and how they would carry it out. But typically some stressful event happens, and we're back to what we talked about, for the earlier part of this semester about a stressful life event, which could be normative or could be traumatic. But typically a stressful life event happens, and individual decides to kill themselves, and the impulsive attempt is when the time between the decision to kill themselves and the action of carrying it out is a very short period of time, like 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And there are many, many suicide attempts and suicides where, again, the time limit is 5 or 10 minutes. Impulsive suicide. So anyway, a total of 1,400,000 attempts in 2017. And yet a total of 47,000 completed suicides, maybe, out of 1,400,000 attempts. So a much smaller number of people who actually die of suicide. And by the way, as we'll see later, only about 1/10 of the people who ever attempt actually end up dying by suicide. 90% of people who make an attempt do not go on to die of suicide. We'll talk a lot more about that later. But just to summarize here, then, basically that there are 7 times as many people who think about suicide as compared to those who make attempts. And some surveys suggest it's even higher than that. And there are 225 people who think about suicide as compared to every one who dies of suicide. And then finally, let's just talk very briefly about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. Is there any way to tell? And unfortunately, we don't have statistics from 2020 yet. It takes such a long time. As I mentioned, these numbers that I'm showing you today from 2019 were only published in January of 2021. So it's going to be almost another year before we have data from 2020, which is, weird and unfortunate. How can we get counts of how many people die of COVID every day. How come we can't get numbers of people to die of suicide, at least, I don't know, by the week or by the month? But the way the reporting system is set up, it doesn't work that way. So there's one interesting study by a sociologist named Ira Wasserman, published 30 years ago, which was a time series modeling of the suicide rates as compared to major societal events in the early 20th century. And his conclusions are that World War I did not influence suicide. Now that's in contrast to what I told you just 10 minutes ago, that many suicidologists think that relative decline in the late 19-teens was due to World War I. But in Wasserman, and I know of him, and he's a reputable statistician and sociologist, his conclusion was that World War I did not necessarily lower the suicide rates, but that the great influenza epidemic, the flu epidemic in 1918, 1919, did increase suicide. And no surprise, he wrote that the reason that the suicide rate increased was the lockdown, the lack of people, of opportunities to intermingle with others due to closing of schools, churches, theaters, dance halls, all the kind of social isolation that we've all experienced ourselves here in the past year, which represents reduced social integration. Remember, that means people who feel part of a larger whole. People feel part of a community, connected to other people, often with reciprocal obligations, but a sense of connection. And that reduced social integration typically leads to higher rates of suicide. Okay, so that concludes this discussion. We'll have, I think more time to talk about some of the implications of these, some of our thoughts about the reasons behind some of these different numbers in class. Okay, so I'll see you then, and I'll see you in our next video.